This evening will be more of a presentation than anything else, but we had the opportunity to go down and visit Luke at Mary Lee a couple of weeks ago to gather footage down there. Recognizing that this is a unique opportunity for Luke as he wraps up 22 years at Mary Lee, to reflect back on some of that work and some of the things that he's learned that will carry forward into his ongoing endeavors. We wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to record some of that and document it in a way that we can continue to share going forward.
Yes, well, thank you, Phil. It's great to be with all of you this evening and to share some perspectives on these years that I've spent working at Mary Lee as executive director. It has been a lot of fun working with Phil and David at getting the videos together, as well as kind of planning out what some of the core thoughts would be that I'm sharing this evening. So it is a reflection. It's great to have a reflection picture up here for you to see this evening to get started. Down at Onion Bottom, just kind of seeing it in the fall and this beautiful reflection that's going on. And so I started in 1997 and I'm retiring at the end of June. So those are the years that I am reflecting on. Although you'll find me skipping around once in a while to even older history that's out there. But one of the core concepts that I have learned during my time at Mary Lee is the concept of ecological leadership. I did not know that term when I came 22 years ago. I was finishing my doctorate in educational leadership and I did not know that term. And that's okay, but it indicates one of the kinds of learnings that I have appreciated during these years in particular. And I think that it's important for us to think about kind of context for a little bit, like the context of Mary Lee, the context even of my own life and work, and how it's brought me through these years in several different ways. And what I've realized in these 22 years that there's a lot that's happened that has been inspired by beauty for me. So the beauty that I've seen as I've walked the trails, winter frost, for example, or spring flowers, all of these things bring an inspiration to my inner being and begin to change how I look at life and how I reflect with other people. So I am pleased to be inspired by the beauty of nature that surrounds us, and I hope that you are as well. Once upon a time, before 22 years ago, I was a school principal for 20 years. And so there I am running this school in Western Pennsylvania. But I knew that a switch was happening, and so when you make switches to another place, like this 1,189 acres of Mary Lee, I remember seeing this map online. The internet was functioning back in 1997, right? Everybody knows that. The map didn't quite look the same. I'm not sure that it was as nicely colored, but I remember looking at that as I was applying to become the director, not quite knowing what all this would mean as a change for me. I obviously was very familiar with running a school and lots of ins and outs of that, and I knew that this was a leadership position in an educational organization, Goshen College and Mary Lee in particular. But what is that going to mean to enter this particular landscape? This landscape that you see from an aerial photo that I took a few years ago, looking from the west of Mary Lee going off toward the east side. You see most of the boundary of Mary Lee in this. My office for these years has been, well, there's Wolf Lake by US 33, and my office has been over here at the Learning Center. Reith Village is another spot that's our collegiate center, and I'll reference that a little bit later as well. So this landscape, this palette of beauty, its many trails, the many interactive ecosystems are very essential to me. And so peering into who I am at the core was one of those early reflecting things. And I don't quite remember if it was during the interview. It was definitely in my very early days of starting in at Mary Lee, that I realized that there were three major parts of my life that were coming together in a way that seemed to have a lot of synergy. And it's actually something that has kept me going in many ways since. And so the three parts are the concept of leadership. That was the field I was already working in. It was where my graduate degrees happened to be. The area of ecology, my undergraduate degree in biology, so that being an important part. But up until that point, it had been largely hobby, I would call it. Gardening, hiking in the Laurel Mountains of Western Pennsylvania, and other kinds of things with the family. And the concept of faith being an important thing too that was woven through the fabric of my life and expressed in different ways, from personal to academic study that I had done in a variety of areas. And so here was this grand purple job at Goshen College, the great Goshen College purple, right? And I realized that, oh my goodness, here we have all of these pieces coming together in the one job itself. And so that's where the synergy began to happen for me in new ways. And one of the ways I express it in my work, probably starting about 15 years ago, is the concept of creation care. So caring for creation is the result of this intersection for me in particular. So one of the little video clips, I've put these in a few places in here, help to reflect on a number of these things. So listen to this one. I'm a fan of Parker Palmer, who does a lot of good reflective writing. His most famous book is Courage to Teach, but I've enjoyed his books like Hidden Wholeness and Let Your Life Speak, and his most recent one, On the Brink of Everything. And what he says in a number of his writings is pay attention to who you are at the core and live that out, because that's where you're going to have energy for doing that. So I realized that my childhood of growing up in northern Minnesota is part of what made my connection to caring about the environment, both the beauty of that space and how I cared for the farm where I grew up, recognizing the injustices with my classmates, Ojibwe, indigenous people, has made a greater sensitivity to me in that regard. But then just the act of being involved with the soil itself. So I'm out here and I'll come in and I'll say to Becky, my wife, I'll say, I feel so good. I feel like I'm farming. I am farming. So to be able to do urban farming in the city of Goshen has been just a wonderful experience. So the concept of connecting to who you are at the center was something that was very affirming for me, and I'm expressing it now just a week or so ago as we were filming as well. So to recognize this intersection, I find it fascinating to look at another piece I saw right at the beginning when I was applying as well, something that's still true today. And so here's one of our major programming areas, from the farmstead to Wreath Village, and to think about the mission of Mary Lee itself and what does it have to say. Well, the first part has to do with preserving the plants and animals of our region, and so providing this natural sanctuary being a part of it. And secondly, the idea of providing ways for people to engage with the environment, to learn both about natural history, but also issues, all of that woven in. And it's always a lot of fun when you get to have the word all in your mission statement, so you can't leave anybody out, right? So all people can be a part of this experience. But interestingly, as you noticed in my earlier slide about the intersection for myself, it was this third part that really resonated, where I saw that this was also a place that provided a setting for recreating opportunities that would benefit body and spirit. There's a lot of wrapping up in there about what goes on. There are documents that explain what recreating means, and it's clear that it's not playing sports. It's not anti-sports. It's something else that happens when you're outside, including some of the early documents talk about good outdoor work that you would do, which is recreating for body and spirit. And so when I talk about getting my hands in the soil, that's something that also happens to me there. And of course, the idea that we do it in a way that's healthy for the whole of the ecosystems. So stepping back, when I was in high school, I knew nothing about this at all. I was in northern Minnesota, but here's Lee Wreath and his mother-in-law standing out on the first 80 acres of land that were purchased to begin the formation of Mary Lee. And Mary Jane used to tell me that Lee came home, and these are pictures from about the era when they were buying Mary Lee, that Lee just came home and said, guess what I did today? I bought this piece of land. Well, he was buying land all the time, mostly for gravel pits, right, for Wreath Riley, but he was buying this piece in particular because he said people are not connecting to nature anymore, and there needs to be a better way to do that, and let's work on that. And so they worked with their Methodist Church in South Bend initially, and then, of course, created an independent nonprofit by 1967. And this is, for me, it's a fascinating aerial photograph because when one looks at this photograph, you see in the foreground let's see, where's my pointer happening? There we go. Isn't that beautiful? Look at that. So there's where Wreath Village is located. And here's the farmstead. And way over here is where the Learning Center is, north of south of Bear Lake. And so having this kind of concept of a changing landscape, the idea of what we can do over time to restore land as we recognize at Mary Lee. So in the beginning, in 1967, they formed a nonprofit, and here they're putting up the sign. Doug Waldman is the director, and he was living down this lane, and I'm not sure who these young people are that are helping, but the original name of Mary Lee was Mary Lee Nature and Religious Foundation. And so you see this wrapping core of faith that is woven into the purpose of Mary Lee from its very beginning. And here's what it looked like 2 years before it was donated to Goshen College. This was the entry lane going back to the Learning Center building, which is right back there in the woods. And so in 1980 then, Lee and Mary Jane Wreath, along with Dr. J. Lawrence Burkholder, president of Goshen College, signed the papers to donate this property to Goshen College for the purpose of providing environmental education experiences. And here are a couple statements that come out of that document. It is the intention of the college that it will constitute an integral part of the educational program and expects to develop an environmental nature and earth study department. Now, it only took us 31 years to get to actually forming a department at Mary Lee, but the vision was there, and you just have to work out of that core, and you keep on working on it. And there's actually a sustainability and environmental education department, a Goshen College department that is at Mary Lee. But Lee and Mary Jane and the early Mary Lee wanted to make sure that this was not just for Goshen College, it was also for many other people to engage. But you notice this phrase that continues to be written in, to not damage the land, right? The idea of restoration. I found a letter that Lee Wreath wrote back in 1965, which I call the very first public program of Mary Lee. And in 1965, this public program was some neighbor asking for permission if they and their family could have a picnic on this property that just had become Mary Lee property. And Lee says, yes, you can do that, blah, blah, blah. Here's how to get in the gate. And everything needs to be like it was when you came. You cannot disturb the land. So that was a theme that he repeated over and over again. Now, I had the opportunity of working with Mary Jane directly for the first about 3 years. She lived longer, but was not able mentally to engage anymore. But to learn some things directly from her is a particular benefit for me as a person as well. I was also privileged to work with a lot of other people, in particular Larry Yoder, who was the executive director prior to me. We continued on, I as the executive director, and he was assistant to the executive director, and we built a friendship that continues today. And this is a photo from when he retired in 2007. And so we continue to correspond with each other and have coffee together, et cetera. So one of the things that comes back to this ecological leadership idea is, how do you model what's going on? And this is one of my first models that I drew to try to understand this back in 1998. And I was trying to understand, with a newly formed board and a new director and new people in leadership at Goshen College, what is the relationship? And so we're not really focusing tonight on what each of these models are about, but you can see that there's the Goshen College bubble and the Mary Lee bubble. And so how close and how interactive is that? And actually, most people, as I talk to them, because I would talk to all kinds of folks about it, would say, well, it's something about like this, maybe sometimes something like that. And so the modeling was one of the ways to help me sort of sort through a bunch of those understandings. So that gives you a quick little context of the setting into which I engage, both as a person and also as an organization with a purpose and mission as well. So secondly, I think it's important for us to really note the importance of the landscape and ecology and what it says to us. So when I talk about ecological leadership, I'm not talking about training somebody to be a leader so you can run an environmental center. Right? That's not what that means. Instead, it's leadership that's based on principles that you learn from watching and observing and participating in ecological systems. So it's a much more holistic, interactive thing, and I'll touch on that a little bit further along. But the landscape and knowing that is important. So here is a photo from High Lake, beautiful setting, the beginning of the southern branch of the Elkhart River that speaks to our lives and even influences the kind of programmatic directions that we take. And so as you know, I've had opportunity to take aerial photographs around Mary Lee. You see the beauty, the diversity of this amazing landscape and all the changes that happen. So here's another little video clip where I'm talking about the land of Mary Lee.
Mary Lee history, it doesn't start in 1964, right? And it doesn't start in 1827 when the first land surveyor stuff started happening here. It started way before that. So being more truthful to the indigenous history of the land. We philosophically, in a land management perspective, believe that we need to be active. The word restoration itself has a limit because the question should be restored to what? So you have to pick a point in time that you feel in your study represents a healthy system. So the interactions with native peoples on this landscape is probably a pretty good indicator of what it could be like. Well, I love standing on this ridge and kind of looking out across additional landscape that all made up this upper kind of high level of this watershed that we're standing on. So you can imagine that all this water that falls on this site is making its way down into High Lake. And we know that by having the water fall on the systems that we're working at bringing back health to, means that more water gets filtered well before it enters the lake system. The fact that we're at the headwaters of the river system, if we can have the best quality water going in there possible, that's a great thing. It benefits everything from here to Lake Michigan. And so the prairie part that we see here is obviously a key factor in it. The woodlands that are around beside us here, and then heading off down you can see some section that we've again burned this spring. And on up over the hill, that's a sand hill that has been thinned out. Fires introduced on a regular basis every couple years for sure. You see kind of a savanna. Off in the distance to the east, you can see a wetland, and it creates a habitat for all kinds of creatures, waterfowl, amphibians, macroinvertebrates, and then all the surrounding animal creatures in the ecosystems that will make contact with that. I remember walking this very landscape with Bill Minter and some visitors, and somebody said, "So is it looking like what you want it to?" And you can look across here and there's obviously signs of a pretty healthy prairie in a spring that we're seeing. And Bill said, "You know, that looks pretty good, but it's a long time after any of us are alive that this system will really be healthy." So it's on this longer term trajectory. And so for me as a leader, recognizing what I do today may not have particularly amazing results that are seen this year or next year, but I want to choose things that can have a longer term impact.
So the concept of ecological time that I'm referencing there is a really critical piece to understand. And it's quite counter to what we engage with in much of Western civilization, where we like to see results now. We want to see them happen fast, and we pour on energy to be able to get it there. And sometimes we have to invest energy to turn the corner. So like in the prairies, there's this energy that helps it turn the corner toward health. But then you have to wait for ecological time to bring the full of the restoration together. And so again, the kind of beauty that we see in the landscape does inspire us to continue to explore, to continue to understand what this does to our being even while the ecosystem itself becomes healthier and benefiting the full of the watershed that we are part of. So another concept that I have learned in studying ecosystems and learning from my colleagues at Mary Lee is the concept of restoration and resilience.
Philosophically, in a land management perspective, believe that we need to be active in the land management versus passive, just see what happens. So for example, I was mentioning what this looked like 10 years ago. And one could say generally it was a mess because it was just all kinds of brambles and brushy stuff. Not that those are bad species, but it was not a healthy system. The reason that it ended up that way is it just was what happens when you've disturbed a landscape a lot and it lost its vibrancy, and it's a long journey for it to recover. It just, there are remnant things around that can help that happen, but we realize that we as humans have had a huge impact on this. So let's invest some of our energy back into helping the ecosystem have greater resilience in its own way. So we're working alongside the resilience of an ecosystem. Healthy ecosystems are food chains, and talking about coming back to the mice have their role in the system, burrowing, creating tunnels, eating various kinds of seeds and insects, all kinds of whatever's in their food diet, but they are also food for others. And there is death and life that's going to keep happening. So, for example, to say that we're not going to burn the prairie because some mice are going to die is really not a very good, deep understanding of what ecological systems are doing. We're not going out here to kill the mice. We're working at a healthier ecosystem. And that's a pretty fascinating term to think about, even in terms of leadership. Now, I'm not promoting the death of anything, really, but to recognize that we have to figure out the ways that we can lead toward health. So having holistic health in systems, whether that's a biological, ecological kind of system or whether it's a human system, but even more importantly, it's the interface of both of those at the same time. So those are complex questions and raise all kinds of ethical questions that can go along with it. But if one is to take a single linear ruler approach, like ruler, 2 words there, then you probably are going to have a lot of unintended outcomes that are not healthy.
So the landscape clearly speaks to us even as we engage with that. So the third area to think about tonight is the whole concept of environmental education, clearly named as part of our mission statement as well. And so to think through what Mary Lee has been, when Mary Lee was donated to Goshen College in 1980, and even on up until the mid-90s, the core of the work, and we had a lot of fun changing from my computer to David's, and then he got this wonderful spiral in there. I'm usually not quite that fancy, but you get to chuckle along with me when I see that happen. But the initial piece was focusing on this land preservation. Another important piece was the public program, so engaging the public. And the third area in particular happened to be working with our school groups in our region, and we became well known for that for many, many years. So where do you build from that? So what do you do? And that was one of the things that we began working on together as a team in 1997, 1998, and began exploring things. So here's actually the result of our strategic planning work. You see the 5 major points going down through here that we're going to work toward. We turn those into sheets like this. And so what you're seeing here is a lot of linear stuff and organization that we were doing. Even while if we were to actually study this, you start to see the intersections between various pieces. But you see my ecological kind of focus coming in when I start drawing it like this, where the model starts to show a bunch of different interconnections where you can see the environmental education and how that intersects with a bunch of other activities that we were doing. How the land management fits in, and both for models of restoration, but also supporting education. The undergraduate collegiate programs that we were starting to develop, and these of course exist today. The one here, interdisciplinary, is actually our sustainability leadership, sustainability studies at Goshen College now, the agroecology summer intensive. So all of these pieces were visioned out and started to emerge there, as you see in 2004. And the concept too that we had a role, both as a local Mary Lee community as well as the connections in broader communities, to figure out what does this mean. And so you see the kinds of terms that we identified that would be a part of this system that we were thinking about. So we started adding other things like the agroecology. We added the Masters in Environmental Education with our 11th cohort now finishing at the end of this month. We added the area of research in a focused way with our Institute for Ecological Regeneration, realizing the work that we were doing in land, education, and faith had a very important aspect to study and record and disseminate to other people, and so that helps us do that. And then this interdisciplinary work with sustainability leadership. So this represents now kind of the plethora, intersection of many things that we do together. And so here's a quick little piece on education. Graduates from the first cohort to the 10th one coming down the way here. We more or less have every day for the whole 11-month grad program on this board. So every day when they walk by to class, they walk by their schedule. And along the way, you have the fun of all these little collective tidbits, artifacts that are added to their experience. So you see the creativity that's part of this bigger experience. When students come to Mary Lee, we don't want them just to kind of walk casually through an ecosystem, which is a great thing to do, but to actually be immersed into the setting and to spend longer blocks of time.
Being able to live here and walk the trails from Hustling House to the Learning Center has been about a quarter of my education, and it's been really eye-opening learning the place this in-depth.
The bigger kind of visionary piece that formed Mary Lee, the idea of getting people connected to land, that was what Lee and Mary Jane wanted to have happen. I'm very excited in my career here at Mary Lee to have been part of starting the graduate program. And it's also great to be in the room with the 11th cohort of the graduate program today. To have the grad program has really been helpful in terms of being able to expand our vision so that it goes way beyond the borders of Mary Lee, because we knew that having people trained here at Mary Lee in terms of the kind of work we do means that all of these students head out to places around the world to continue our work in creative and wonderful ways as well. So I had the opportunity to also help to start our international environmental component of the grad program. So here's the first cohort in 2017 when we were standing out there on the edge of Andros Island. If you look really hard, well, no, you really can't see it, but Florida's off in the distance there. So it's been a wonderful expanded experience that I could talk about as well. But just for us to continue to think about this whole broadening experience for us as individuals at Mary Lee, and how does Mary Lee reach out and touch other places. And it's been a delight to work with Peter Douglas on the far left, who's become a friend. But also his work there and the parallels to our work are quite fascinating to see. And I also have had the opportunity to teach in the sustainability leadership the last number of semesters. And one of our goals is that by the end of the semester, our students, or at least the professors, are able to walk on water at the end, right? We didn't do too bad this year, right? It happened to just be a nice frozen thing, and they said, well, we started out with canoes, let's get out a canoe and let's take our picture in a canoe. We have a lot of fun working together in this program that explores the watershed. So lots of things happen around environmental education, lots of details that we could add to it, but how this becomes an important part of this relationship in a network that we learn from studying ecology. So understanding the various nodes and components are a part between people and the land and all those systems are important to us. So another part that becomes critical is how do you help your facilities connect appropriately into this broader piece. And so green buildings became one of the parts that I engaged with a great deal. One of our most sustainable buildings is this building. It's our barn at the farmstead. This is 1915 with the family standing in front of the barn. Isn't that a grand picture? You all should have pictures like this. A local woman in Wolf Lake came over and said, hey, here's a picture. This is my grandma standing right here, she said. And this woman's a grandma herself. So it was a lot of fun to look at that. But then, you know, to realize that, okay, this is a new era. What can we do? The renovation that we did back in 98, 99 turned this into a working space for us that really serves programming at multiple levels and ages. We also said, well, we have a geodesic dome that's been sitting here on pallets for 10 years. What do we do with this? And so I said, well, put it together. Now, interestingly, when Becky and I left Western Pennsylvania, we were clearing house. I mean, we weren't going to move everything we had collected in 20 years. And we had, back in the early 80s, gotten dome kit plans. And I got rid of all that stuff. And I show up here, and lo and behold, there's a dome, and it's from the same company that I had a kit plan from. And I actually got to help put it together. But it serves us well. Grad students live at the lower level. Our geology programs take place out of the upper level. The Learning Center back in 1972, the first building that was built at Mary Lee. So it was being built. You can still see the stickers on the windows. You can see that they haven't quite finished shingling across the top there yet. And for us to say, okay, so what does that mean for us? And so over time, we now have developed a very sustainable building. We have a solar array that produces about 86% of our electricity for this facility annually. And so we've done 3 additions during these last 22 years. I enjoyed the inspiration of these 3 women in the early years of my work there. So you see Mary Jane standing next to me, President Shirley Showalter, and Agnes Eichste. And so all 3 of these women were encouragers, and the oldest women were so excited that there finally was a woman president at Goshen College. And they would tell me about how important that was. I'm sure they told Shirley that along the way as well. But another major piece that started happening for us was we needed a spot for our undergraduate collegiate students to study long-term on site. And so this is a slide from way back when we started our thinking. And here you actually see where Wreath Village is located. We had to clear a bunch of trees. A lot of them had just kind of sprouted up, a lot of cottonwood trees. And so the whole Wreath Village experience began to happen. We did some very careful thought with what does sustainable buildings mean. Bill Browning was a person I worked directly with. He was from the Rocky Mountain Institute. And so Glenn, you were in on these meetings too. Paul, you were around when this stuff was happening. And so one of the things that Bill Browning said is that we need to understand that we send subtle but powerful messages about our worldview in the way we design our buildings. So our buildings speak to that, and I'll talk about that in another video in a little bit. So we decided to build the first phase. You see it outlined here. We started in 2005. We decided instead of having a ground-breaking experience, let's be a little more gentle on the earth, so let's have a ground-healing experience. And so we had compost, we had trowels, we had water, and so we made it a very interactive experience as we were beginning the process of building Wreath Village. So it got built and started being used in 2006. Marcos Stolz, sitting back here, was in the first class in a May term that got to use it. Now he's back working at Mary Lee. So nice round connection that we have. And after collecting data for a year, at the end of 2007, we received the platinum rating from the U.S. Green Building Council. It was presented then in 2008 once the plaque had arrived. And so this itself became a really major message point. We built it so students could live there and learn from that setting. But it became a teaching tool, and I literally have given tours to thousands of people about what this means. And so the impact in our region has been very beneficial, kind of a side benefit to what we were thinking about. So a great place for studying. You can see it in its full array now. There's a greenhouse and barn that are part of this as well.
Well, I'm grateful to be here at Wreath Village and to talk about this site where we've worked on sustainable design and construction principles. One of the things that we realized early on in our planning was to recognize that the buildings are going to be teachers in and of themselves. David Orr is a leading environmental educator teaching at Oberlin College. Said that your buildings are always going to be there, and the way they function and the way people interact with them will be part of the instruction. So one of the real early commitments we made was that we wanted this place to be a learning community. When students or participants come to gather here and learn here, they're going to do it in relationship with each other, as participants, as instructors, as the land, as the buildings, all incorporated with each other. One of the things that we're able to see just as we stand here and look around, obviously a wind turbine and solar energy production. I typically refer to those things last in presentations. There's the assumption that that's what made these buildings green. And that's not the case. We would have been very close to achieving the platinum rating without having either one of those. And what that really means is the way you put a building together intentionally and carefully, and conserving energy is the goal, is the way to achieve green design, rather than just throwing some decorative things on there. Now, these are not just decorative, but I'm overstating that because that's where people often want to focus, and they're not addressing the bigger issues of how much energy are you using in the first place. In this era of North American building, are built under a 20-year net present value concept. That means that you want the building to produce enough outputs for your intended purpose that you recover your costs in 20 years or less. And then you can basically discard your building and go on and make another one and do that all over again, and you keep having a good return on investment. Well, that doesn't fit at all within the value system that we have for regenerative and sustainable design. We wanted durability, long-term lasting in the things that we were putting together here. So the metal roofing is one of those examples of a material that's going to last a good 100 years. That means that over the lifetime of these buildings, you probably have to put at least 3 different asphalt shingle roofs on this. There's no good recycling purpose for asphalt shingles. These roofs are totally recyclable. So while it costs additional money to buy that material up front, it saves itself over and over again throughout the lifetime of the building. So by making that wiser choice, we have benefited some executive director and set of Mary Lee team members that have not even been born yet.
I snuck ecological time in there again, right? The people that aren't even born yet. You got to be thinking out there somewhere. And so living and learning in the field has become a major emphasis for us as we use these sustainably designed buildings. So the next piece that I mentioned early on that was important to me was this intersection of faith. And I could go a lot of different directions with this, and I've been known to do hour-long presentations just on that topic alone. But I want to just point out a couple things that began to percolate within me. And this was in the midst of doing sustainable building design and thinking. that I began to reflect on some faith statements. So as a Mennonite, I was looking for statements that speak to our responsibility. And one of those really critical ones was this sentence, which is written in the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite Perspective, 1995, where it talks about that the peace God intends for humanity, and that's often what we think about when we think about peace. So we think about peace and justice, and it's about people. So it's saying that's an important thing, but notice that it also says creation was revealed most fully in Jesus Christ. So the authors of that very wisely into a single sentence pulled those two strands that are so critical. It's not people over here and the environment over here, it's here, it's together. And that provided a huge stimulus for me in my thinking. It had an impact on how I would often share about Wreath Village. It had an impact on helping to found the Mennonite Creation Care Network and just other kinds of intersections that played out of that. The wonderful Elkhart River close to town here, where I also think about this idea that comes from the Confession of Faith, that as stewards of God's earth, we are called to care for the earth and bring rest and renewal to the land and everything that lives on it. So that's another call that is there for me. Or the statement that says human beings have been made for relationship with God, to live in peace with each other and take care of the rest of creation. So there are three relationships that are quickly named in that one sentence as well. So you can't just pick and choose out of that sentence. In my opinion, it's like a whole ecosystem. You have to deal with all of those at the same time. And so that's where this concept of ecological leadership comes out even stronger. So Simon Western wrote this book, Leadership, A Critical Text, and in that he outlines several things about leadership, and these are broad categories that he's naming here, but he starts out with this controller thing in the 1900s, then you move into more of a human relations movement therapist thing in the 60s, in the 80s, then you start looking for the one who is going to save your organization, right? If you just get the right leader, everything will change. And he says, those are all important, and you can see the ways in which, each of these strands keep going here, but here you notice he sees the emergence of an eco-leader. And so just a couple of the thoughts related to this is this idea that there's this intersection, this connectivity, interdependence, ethics, leadership, spirit. It'd be fun to study and talk about all these pieces, but it's not just about the environment, but dealing with the internal ecology of an organization as well. So that's the heartbeat of what ecological leadership really means. So then it gets a little more complex for me, because I keep thinking about this stuff. And in sustainability, we talk about triple bottom lines. We talk about making sure that the people are healthy and the planet is healthy, and that our economics are healthy. There are all these kinds of things that we tie together, but every time you talk about that three-legged stool or the three intersecting bubbles, the reality is there's always something underneath that. There's some value system that's going to drive what goes on here. And so last summer, I began working on this because it related to a course that David was in a couple years ago for me, and thinking through this and starting to put together pieces from a bunch of different authors that I read. And so I'll just highlight a couple of these things. So this is the real critical centering piece, that everybody has a set of values. So sometimes when you start out, like I just gave quotes from a Christian perspective, a Mennonite perspective in particular, and that could be very off-putting to somebody. But when you start here, you say, okay, let's open the door and let's all look into our value system and what's critical to us. And so these 6 items that you see around here, Siegelman gathered these together with some other materials and was noting that these 6 values or virtues show up in all the world's major religions. They're present. And even people who don't prescribe to a particular religion end up representing these in many different ways. So not that this is a complete list, but it's a very fascinating beginning point for me or for students or other participants to start thinking about. And the beauty of it is I like to start with transcendence here. And so, for example, there's a tie that someone else, Rook and Proyer, did with character strengths. So when you look at the actual descriptions here for transcendence, you see that it involves appreciation of beauty and excellence, gratitude, hope, humor, and spirituality. So it expands that out. Now, another author worked on the concept of sustainability leaders. And so Mary Furtick pulls together these 8 components, and we don't have time to look at all of these, but I was looking at the intersections between these, and you'll notice that these also, like if you look at expand conscious awareness, it means grounding conversations and actions in personal integrity, practicing conscious awareness. And so each one of these have further definitions. And since we're talking about sustainable leaders, we also have to think about the whole systems thinking as well. And so that's where you look at the work of Donella Meadows, and you see these blue categories around here. And like this one over here, number 4, stay humble, stay a learner. And you can look how each one of these, she doesn't necessarily think of these in sequence. They're numbered. The numbers on here are her numbers. But for me, I laid all this stuff out on my desk and hoped the wind wouldn't blow and tried to figure out, so what are the connections between all of these pieces? And it has become a very helpful conversation piece for students as we work through it, because I print it out on a big sheet and we can talk about it. People draw their own models and think about how it represents them. And this is actually something that I am committed to continuing to study even in retirement. I've got a lot of books I haven't read on some of these topics yet, and I want to play around with some more parts in this model and find ways that it actually becomes meaningful for us in making decisions. Brene Brown, speaking on leadership, says, I define leadership as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who has the courage to develop that potential. And I've been committed to that as well, and I've appreciated the people who've been committed to helping me in that same regard. So finally, I'd like to just do a little bit of reflecting on personal integration, because it ties into the future then. So thinking about this particular planting in the back of our property is one of the ways to do that. And Phil and I were walking through there as David was filming, and so listen to some of my comments.
One of the things that I have been thankful for in my 22 years at Mary Lee is how it incorporated so closely to some really important factors for me personally. One of the things I get to do at home is to pay attention to the ecology more directly. It's the gardening and connecting directly with getting my hands in the soil where I get my greatest recharge. And 6 years ago, I started planting a fruit, nut, and berry orchard. And so I'd like you to meet this woody perennial polyculture, edible forest, fruit and nut berry orchard. So the first row where you see posts over here is a fruit tree row, followed by a nut tree row as the primary tree, fruit tree row, nut tree, fruit tree. And then you see that there are vines, there are brambles, like raspberries, blackberries, and other fruiting bushes. It's been fun to think about how I can plant this land and it will produce food for us to eat, food for us to sell, food for us to share, and actually be a greater return on investment than if I had taken that same amount of money and put it in the stock market, even when the stock market is performing really well. So I can turn this around and play it out in our own economic system, except I also see how well it works in different economic systems like trading and bartering systems. People are always going to need food. People are always going to need quality food. And so why not think about it in that regard rather than just in a dollar and cents kind of calculation in the economy. I also was learning about this land and its long-term history, how the Potawatomi had for some centuries lived and counted on the Elkhart Prairie as being a major food source production for them. So I was very aware of that. I was also aware of the injustices that are coupled with the settlers coming in, the government forming treaties that were not in favor of the indigenous people. So all of those components coming out of the doctrine of discovery were weighing on me at the same time as I'm working in this very soil that once had been tilled and cared for by the Potawatomi themselves. I also know that settler people cared about this land when they came in, and they found it to be very rich and nourishing. And here I am digging holes in this ground and experiencing the same kind of thing. And so I was struggling both with the realization of all these people who cared about this land and the transfers of land that were not just in many cases, and yet I'm the recipient and owner of this land. But I live under a commitment that I want to make sure land is healthier into the future, and how do I do that? And so the kinds of plantings I'm doing here are a way to do that, because I'm working in permanent kinds of approaches. That doesn't mean the trees will live forever, but all the trees I've planted are very likely to live longer than I'm going to live.
So just a little energy I get from that kind of experience. And of course the beauty comes back as you watch things bloom in the spring. Lots of our produce doesn't go very far to get into our kitchen, just a few feet away from there. And so here you see in that first year of the planting what it looked like, and now after 5 growing seasons, it's heading into its 6th growing season. And the reality is, in the last month, I bought another ½ acre and have replicated it. And you see, I took this picture last night as I was out there working. And so planting another orchard, again, with the same concept in mind as a personal application to my commitment to care for the earth. And so I'll end with this little quote called perfection is
You can just
overrated.
become stymied and inactive, period, because you say, there's no way I can do it perfectly. Well, I must say that perfection is overrated. So we each are called to do tasks faithfully, to be open to learning, but we don't each have to do everything. So we each do our own part. We pay attention to what our neighbor is doing and be supportive and encouraging to them. And so if our neighbor's passion is to work very hard on injustices from racism, that's great. I will make sure I'm not working somehow against that, and I'll try to practice it well myself. But they may need to take the leadership in that. I may take the leadership in good quality gardening. The next person may take the leadership in social organizing, and the list goes on and on. But I think we have to free each other up without kind of this sense of judgment, like you're not doing everything, therefore you must not be committed enough. Well, that's just not a healthy approach at any point. And
so we each have our role to play. You don't all have to do this. But as I'm saying there, we each have this responsibility as we work together as a community on sustainability, regeneration concepts. So thank you for listening, and we can have a little conversation together here as well.